Arratsaldeon dizuela guztioi, Bilbao Balondigaren izenean, mila esker saio hontara berriz ere etorri zaretelako. Buenas tardes, bienvenidos, bienvenidas a esta sesión de alguna forma inaugural de Gutun Zuria del Festival Literario, que como sabéis este año habla sobre mentiras y sobre secretos y que además cumple su quinta edición. Hemos querido invitar este año a destacados autores, sobre todo norteamericanos, para que reflexionen ante nosotros sobre la relación que en su opinión existe entre la verdad y la mentira, de ahí el título, Secretos y Mentiras. Gaurko arratsaldean, bi egile, bi idazle, kazetari bat, bi kazetari izango ditugu arratsaldeko 8:00, Txak Palaniuk izango da gure artean, eta oraintxe bertan une batetik bestera Iñaki Gabilondo kazetariak Bill Kellerrekin solasaldia izango du. For Bilbao Balondiga, it's a real pleasure to have all these writers and journalists with indeed proven reputation in this festival among us. So first of all, thank you very much for agreeing our invitation. Ere eskertu nahi dugu bide batez. La dinámica de esta sesión será bastante simple, será una conversación que mantendrán Iñaki Gabilondo y Bill Keller de cerca de 1 hora y después dedicaremos cerca de 1/4 de hora a las preguntas que les queráis formular o a las consideraciones o reflexiones que queráis hacer llegar a este auditorio. Eso sí, os pediríamos que tan pronto como finalice la sesión, a las 8:15, desalojéis el auditorio tan pronto como sea posible, de forma que podamos comenzar la próxima sesión lo más puntuales posibles. La conversación será, Iñaki creo que hablará en castellano, Bill Keller le responderá en inglés. Creo que todos o casi todos y todas tenéis los aparatos de traducción simultánea. El canal 1 es el de castellano, el 3 es el de euskera y el 2 es el de inglés, si lo queréis seguir. Perdona, el 2 es el de... Me he hecho un lío, 1 castellano, 3 inglés y 3 euskera y 2 inglés, perdón. 1 castellano, 3 euskera y 2 inglés. Menudo lío. Además, hablando 3 idiomas, la verdad es que uno se hace un chocolate en la mente que ya no sabe ni qué decir. It's not always easy to have the chance to listen to two great journalists, like indeed are the two people, the two men who we are going to listen to today here in a great conversation, you will see. Bill Keller fue director de The New York Times entre 2003 y 2011, una de las épocas más convulsas de Estados Unidos en los últimos años, con los ecos todavía del 11S, el apogeo neoconservador de George W. Bush, la invasión de Irak y la crisis financiera a partir de 2008. Fue corresponsal en Moscú desde 1986 hasta la disolución de la Unión Soviética. Gracias a su trabajo en la capital rusa consiguió ni más ni menos que el Pulitzer de periodismo en 1989. Nire aldetik besterik ez, zuekin guztiokin, Iñaki Gabilondo eta Bill Keller.
We decide to wait 2 minutes because they are the queue. Hola, buenas tardes. Nos han pedido que esperemos un par de minutos porque hay al parecer una cola de personas que están esperando para el apartito de la traducción. Así que vamos a esperar un poquitín a que puedan entrar.
Okay.
Can you hear one?
Yeah.
Listen. We can try. Podemos aprovechar para escuchar a la doctora. Sí, escucho muy bien. Perfecto. You can say something about Bilbao.
I'll be happy to do that. I think we wait for people to settle down a little bit, though.
Okay.
I would like to say a kind of thank you for inviting me. I would like to say, just to briefly sort of thank you for inviting me before we get too deep into the questions.
Yes. Okay. they say they had for the device for the translation that they queue enormous queue and the people must wait.
I thought everybody in Bilbao spoke about 5 languages.
Yes, in Basque, in English, in Spanish, in French also. Que nos digan los de la organización cuándo les parece que podamos empezar. Sí. Muy buenas tardes, Arratsaldeon. Good afternoon. Un saludo a todos los que han asistido a esta reunión en la que tenemos la oportunidad de conocer a Bill Keller, una eminencia del periodismo, un nombre que los periodistas mencionamos con enorme respeto, que fue desde el año 2003 hasta el año 2011 director de The New York Times, como ha sido recordado ya, que antes fue corresponsal en Moscú, en Johannesburgo, que es uno de los símbolos del gran periodismo, del periodismo de alta calidad, del periodismo más sólido, y que desde el año pasado, desde que dejó la dirección de The New York Times, es uno de los comentaristas más destacados del periódico. Bill Keller es premio Pulitzer por sus trabajos cuando estaba en Moscú como corresponsal, y creo que es para todos nosotros una gran oportunidad conocer sus opiniones, sus puntos de vista en torno a esta materia, secretos y mentiras que nos enfrenta casi con todas las posibilidades abiertas de nuestra profesión. Esta reunión se había programado como una conversación y así se ha anunciado, pero yo creo que estarán ustedes de acuerdo conmigo en que más que una conversación convendría que fuera un encuentro con Bill. Yo voy con mucho gusto a actuar en el papel que creo que me corresponde en una situación como esta, de periodista que va a preguntar a otro periodista. En fin, a mí posiblemente muchos de ustedes me conocen ya, pueden estar más que aburridos de haber escuchado mis puntos de vista sobre las cosas. Sin embargo, no tenemos todos los días la oportunidad de conocer las opiniones de un hombre con la experiencia de Bill Keller, con su solidez y con su enorme prestigio internacional. Es, por tanto, para mí un gran honor y creo que haremos todos lo correcto con esto. Yo quisiera, lo primero, saludar a Bill Keller. Buenas tardes, Bill.
Hello. Can I just say what an honor it is to be here in Bilbao? Somebody told me last night that people in Spain believe in 2 things. They believe in God and they believe in Iñaki Gabilondo, which means it's a special honor to share a stage with him. And as long as we have Iñaki here, then God can be in Lisbon looking out for the football team.
Yo no sé cómo va la fe en Dios, pero sé que la fe en Iñaki Gabilondo ha menguado mucho en los últimos tiempos. Bueno, creo que hay una primera cosa, Bill, que creo que pudiera resultar interesante para para nuestro público aquí reunido y que puede colocarnos bien ante las diferentes culturas, tradiciones de verdadera solidez democrática de España y de los Estados Unidos. Es el caso de El Rey y su cacería en Botsuana, que se ha convertido en un asunto de gran interés. Yo, Bill, creo que a un periodista como tú le puede llamar mucho la atención que haya existido esta relación durante todos estos años del periodismo español y de la jefatura del Estado, una relación tan sumamente discreta, en la que se ha pactado una especie de acuerdo, de discreción, que ahora acaba de estallar, inaugurando un tiempo completamente nuevo. Lo planteo desde la siguiente perspectiva. España es una democracia joven y los periodistas, incluso los que somos ya mayores, tenemos no demasiados años de experiencia de periodismo democrático. Y la fabricación de la democracia estableció, desde los años 70 y tantos, 80, una relación enfermiza, un poco patológica, entre el periodismo y el poder representado por el rey, porque teníamos todos la impresión de que estamos construyendo juntos algo. Y eso que estamos construyendo juntos algo estableció un tipo de relación que ha cambiado, pero del cual se deriva esta especie de extraña enfermedad de la relación, observada las cosas desde el periodismo de verdad. Esta mañana, decía Bill Keller, en nuestro país existe la cultura de la independencia. Y con nuestra cultura de la independencia, desde hace tantos años acreditada, tenemos una experiencia democrática y periodística en la que este tipo de cosas hace mucho que ya están muy clarificadas. ¿Es así como son las cosas, Bill?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I'm not going to comment on the king because we rendered our verdict on the monarchy 250 years ago. I did take note of the fact that he apologized, though, for being. As far as the culture of independence, I think that is true, and it's something we pride ourselves on. But we have not always been immune either from this sense of being just a little too much embedded with the authorities. I mean, the famous example in the United States is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This was, of course, before the internet and before quite the aggressive kind of press we have now. But, you know, he served as president in a wheelchair. And yet, they never showed photographs of the president in his wheelchair, and they never wrote about it. It was a just kind of conspiracy of silence. I think we've gotten beyond that, and in part because we have no choice. There's always somebody who will report everything. But even now, certainly a lot of people would point to the days after 9/11, when there was, I think, a little too much of a sense of the press rallying behind the president and rallying behind the flag, which is one of several reasons why we fell for the stories about weapons of mass destruction.
Bueno, de eso hablaremos dentro de un momento, pero como este ciclo se llama Secrets and Lies, secretos y mentiras, vamos a comenzar aludiendo a las mentiras y también a las mentiras periodísticas, porque Keel llegó a la dirección del periódico. Podía haber llegado algunos años antes, pero llegó a la dirección del periódico como consecuencia, en cierto sentido, de un episodio que padeció el periódico y que fue un episodio de mentiras, un escandaloso episodio de mentira de Jason Blair, periodista del New York Times, que, para gran escándalo de la profesión, en el mundo entero, se descubrió que había estado mintiendo, inventándose reportajes toda la vida. Es posiblemente una de las mentiras más fuertes que hemos conocido, más escandalosas. Fue un impacto brutal, hubo un cambio en la dirección, llegó Bill a la dirección del periódico. En cierto sentido, estamos ya curados, Bill, de la posibilidad de una cosa de este tipo, los sistemas de control. Antes de hablar de los controles a los gobiernos, hablemos de nuestros propios controles. Nuestros sistemas de control profesionales pueden ya asegurar a la sociedad que asuntos como el de Jason Blair y sus mentiras ya no van a ser posibles o ya van a ser más difíciles?
I think it would be much more difficult to get away with the kind of lies that Jason Blair did. In fact, it was a shock to people at the times that he got away with them as much as he did, as long as he did, because it was for months and months and months, many stories, front-page stories, stories where editors should have seen red flags. So that was a shock to the system. We've done a number of things at the Times, such as giving editors more authority to question unnamed sources in stories. An editor has the right at any time to go to a reporter and say, okay, we'll keep this source's name out of the paper, but you have to tell me. You know, the other big difference between today and Jason Blair's day is we have the internet. And we have a whole world of fact-checkers. When the New York Times makes a mistake, we hear about it like that, from somebody out in the internet, and usually from a lot of people in the internet. So could it ever happen again? I mean, journalism is based to some extent on trust. You know, we send people to faraway places, to war zones. We trust that what they're sending back is accurate. We don't have somebody watching over their shoulder. So yes, there is always the possibility that somebody could exaggerate or even make up a story. But it's more difficult now than it would have been, than it was in Jason Blair's day.
Yo quisiera pedirte, Billy, que nos contaras, Bill, un episodio que está en la historia del periodismo y que seguimos desde España en su momento con enorme interés los periodistas, que fue la actitud del New York Times y del director Bill Keller en aquel tenso, muy tenso problema que hubo con el gobierno Bush, cuando, a pesar de ser aquellos momentos patrióticos, como has dicho, después de los sucesos de los atentados de septiembre, de las Torres Gemelas, la ley patriótica que se puso en marcha y algunos de sus aspectos provocaron un episodio aparatoso. De pronto, un buen día, el New York Times, dirigido por Bill Keller, reveló el plan de controles telefónicos y de mails que tenía organizado el Servicio Secreto de los Estados Unidos para localizar las redes de financiación del terrorismo. Se suscitó una disputa teórica de primerísima categoría. La defensa de la seguridad nacional, el patriotismo, digamos, frente al derecho a la información que Bill Keller entendió que tenía en aquel momento que prevalecer porque los asuntos eran de la máxima importancia. Las tensiones fueron muy grandes y las fuimos siguiendo aquí. Se acusó de todo a Bill Keller y quisiera, si es posible, que nos contaras cómo fue aquella historia, cómo se vivió aquella historia y las dificultades que tuvisteis para sacar adelante vuestra posición.
Well, the sharpest conflicts between newspapers and governments tend to be on the subject of national security, because that's where it's so easy for governments to claim secrecy. They put the lid of national security on a subject, and you're not supposed to ask questions anymore. And I've been in a way, on both sides of that with the Bush administration. I mentioned before that, like the King, I've had occasion to apologize. One of the first things I had to do when I became executive editor was publish an apology, a disclosure to the public that some of the stories we wrote before the war in Iraq were not skeptical enough, that we fell too hard for the story about weapons of mass destruction. It's hard to, I know what the King went through. It's hard to say that you did wrong, but it's especially important for newspapers because all you have is your credibility. You know, my other, I guess, starring moment with the Bush administration was, as you say, in 2005 when we published the story about the government eavesdropping on American citizens, listening to their phones and eavesdropping on their emails without any kind of a court warrant, which was certainly questionable legally. The administration argued strenuously, and in fact, the only time that I ever was invited to President Bush's office was to be warned about this, that if we published these stories, we would have blood on our hands if there was another terrorist attack. In the end, we were not convinced that publishing, that this wasn't really telling the terrorists something they didn't know. This was telling the American people something they didn't know about what their government was doing, and we did publish. And we were, on the one hand, those stories won a Pulitzer Prize. On the other hand, we were denounced as traitors by leading figures in the Bush administration.
Sí, recuerdo que hubo incluso gente que dijo en las elecciones legislativas que se iban a celebrar poco después, se decía, estas elecciones de hecho son el patriotismo o el New York Times. Se planteó una disyuntiva así. Pero lo que pregunto al periodista, ¿dudó Bill Keller? Digamos, la decisión que le llevó a publicar aquella información, ¿fue una decisión fácil, una decisión difícil? ¿Tuvo dudas? ¿Qué elementos manejó para dilucidar esa discusión y cuál fue la razón de su decisión?
It was an extremely difficult decision. It took me, there was more than a year between the time that we knew the facts of this program and the time we published. So clearly I thought about this a lot. And initially they made what seemed on the face of it to be a fairly strong case, going up almost to the highest level. We had several members of the cabinet who invited us in. The head of the National Security Agency actually took our Washington bureau chief in and showed him the room where they were doing this eavesdropping to demonstrate that they were not violating any Americans' privacy and so on. But over time, we amassed more evidence, particularly more evidence that people within the administration had doubts about the legality of this program. And in the end, there's no magic formula. You have to use your judgment on these. But in the end, I was comfortable with the judgment that we should publish. Mm-hmm. There are, to this day, some people who disagree, probably including former President Bush.
Bueno, y dentro de la estructura del periódico, el público nos suele preguntar mucho, se suele preguntar mucho, cómo es el proceso de tomas de decisiones en el interior de un medio de comunicación. Y yo quisiera saber, Bill, si una decisión como esta, estamos utilizando ese ejemplo, pero fue un ejemplo muy duro, muy difícil, cómo vivió la relación empresa, dirección, redacción. Porque es un juego en el que la empresa, el editor, el director y la redacción lo pueden vivir. Se vivió de una manera, fue una lucha, fue un acuerdo, fue fácil, fue difícil.
It was easy. We have the executive editor of the Times answers to the publisher, who is the one person who has a foot in the business and a foot in the journalism. I have never during my 8 years as executive editor did the publisher say, don't publish that. He on every occasion, and there were a number of occasions where there was some controversy, supported it as the newsroom's decision. I mean, you go out of your way to make sure that he knows what's coming. You don't want, and in fact, when I was called to the Oval Office to be warned by the president, the publisher came along. He was invited to. But in the end, he made it absolutely clear that it would be my decision. The only tension surrounding that story about the eavesdropping was between the reporters who wrote the story and their editors. They thought we should have published it much earlier. But that was really a journalistic judgment and had nothing to do with advertisers or the business of the paper. I mean, nobody, the idea that somebody from the business side of the paper, the advertising department, for example, would come to the newsroom and say, please don't write this story because it will offend such and such a big advertiser. It would be a scandal in the paper. And the people on the advertising side of this paper, I know some people find this hard to believe, but they actually take great pride in the fact that the newsroom is independent. And it's easier for them, because if some advertiser comes to them and says, I hate this fashion critic. He doesn't like my clothes. You have to get rid of him. The advertising department will say, sorry, I can't even take that question up, but we don't do that.
Yo creo que todos los que estamos aquí reunidos acabamos seguramente de entender cuál es la naturaleza de la diferencia fundamental que se da en el periodismo ya muy acreditado en los Estados Unidos, desde el punto de vista de las costumbres y usos democráticos, y el periodismo español. La existencia de estas líneas en las que no hay colisión. Esta mañana también se planteaba una circunstancia que aquí en España no se conoce, cómo está separada la línea de la redacción, del trabajo de los periodistas, de la línea de los editorialistas. Ninguno sabe lo que está haciendo el otro, y es un juego de independencias que nos resulta un poco sorprendente, como se ha dicho también el sector comercial. Eso es seguramente lo que antes decía Bill, la cultura de la independencia, ¿no? Digamos, muchos años que ya está consolidado ese criterio. No se puede imaginar el cruce, que el anunciante vaya a entrar donde el editor. Eso está en principio bastante clarificado hace años ya, ¿no?
It's clear that is the standard. I have to be completely honest and tell you that not every, the standard is not always met. I've worked at newspapers where at certain times of year, the big advertiser wanted a photograph of their department store on the front page of the paper, and the paper obliged because it was the custom. There are some famous cases in the U.S. when CBS News got information about the relationship between tobacco and cancer, and learned that the tobacco companies actually knew about this but lied about it in public, CBS hesitated for a long time before broadcasting that story. So the thing about the culture of independence is, if you get caught giving in to that kind of pressure, you are universally condemned. There's no excuse for it.
Sí. No, por supuesto, no creemos, ninguno de nosotros es un niño, todos sabemos cómo son las cosas, y tampoco ignoramos que, aun dentro de esa cultura de la independencia, de manera muy sofisticada y en ocasiones muy fuerte, los grandes poderes financieros, etcétera, etcétera, ejercen una presión sencillamente aplastante, ¿no? Ha dicho antes una cosa, lo de pedir disculpas. El rey pidió disculpas ayer, ha dicho también Bill que él un día tuvo que pedir disculpas, o más de un día. Yo también he de decir que yo también he tenido que pedir disculpas muchas veces, lo que contar a Bill Keller aquí el 11M, cuando hubo los atentados de Madrid, el 11M, en la radio en la que yo trabajaba se contó una información que no fue exacta, fue no cierta. Se decía que había habido unos terroristas suicidas, que luego resultó que no era cierto. Yo tuve que asumir la responsabilidad de aquella información, que no fui yo directamente quien la dio, asumí la responsabilidad y luego tuve que pedir disculpas. La petición de disculpas, una tarea, nos suele resultar difícil a los periodistas, que tenemos una especie de orgullo muy raro, ¿no? Pero la petición de disculpas forma parte del juego limpio inexorable, ¿no?
No, I completely agree. I mean, I trust somebody more if they will admit a mistake and apologize for it than somebody who never admits to a mistake. It's become an issue in our presidential campaign, as you probably know, that Mitt Romney, who is almost certainly going to be the Republican nominee, accuses President Obama of apologizing for America. I don't think that's accurate. He's not apologized for America. But the fact that President Obama has gone out in the world with a little bit more humble approach than his predecessor, that he's admitted that maybe America should not preach to the rest of the world, even that is controversial to some people in the U.S., that it offends their sense of American pride. That's one of the things that I've actually found admirable in President Obama, that he has been willing to sort of step down from this American pedestal as if we're the only country that knows what's right, and actually listen and open up to the rest of the world. But that is not universally accepted as the proper approach for a president.
Desde que cayó Lehman Brothers y estalló esta gran crisis, en España, de una manera muy generalizada, hemos llegado a aceptar un principio. La caída de Lehman Brothers y la crisis financiera que se desencadenó inmediatamente como consecuencia de aquello ha puesto de manifiesto, sin disimulo ninguno, quién manda aquí. La democracia es un poder subordinado al verdadero poder, que es el poder financiero. Todo el mundo está convencido de que la democracia ha quedado, en cierto sentido, desenmascarada como un poder débil, sometido a unos poderes más fuertes. En este contexto, quería saber, primero, si está de acuerdo, y en segundo lugar, ¿cuál es su respuesta a este recorrido? Yo, cuando era más joven, creía que los periodistas lo sabíamos todo. Cuando fui más mayor, me di cuenta de que sabíamos poco. Cuando fui mucho más mayor, descubrí que apenas sabíamos nada. Y ahora que ya soy muy mayor, creo que tampoco los gobiernos saben casi nada.
You have to be a little careful not to give up.
No.
It is true that sometimes we pretend to know things when we actually don't. The relationship between democracy and money is, I think, more complicated than just democracy is subordinate to money or the other way around. I mean, we are, the United States Supreme Court last year rendered a decision that allows almost unlimited spending by private individuals and corporations in our elections. And so we have these things called super PACs, where they raise millions and millions of dollars to attack President Obama, to attack the other candidate, whatever candidate they don't like. And that clearly gives a disproportionate influence in democracy to people with money. But it's not an insurmountable barrier. Money doesn't always win, and this will sound extremely self-serving, but I think the argument for a free press is it's the best antidote to the people with a lot of money.
Sí, lo que digo es que mientras estamos tratando de adivinar un secreto del gobierno, que a lo mejor es un secreto destacado, pero de segundo nivel, los grandes secretos escapan de nuestro escrutinio y en el mundo de las altas finanzas, el mundo de Wall Street, de los paraísos fiscales, el mundo armamentista, el de los centros de poder, las mafias criminales, el narcotráfico. ¿No tiene Bill la impresión de que nosotros vigilamos la acción de gobierno y también de estas organizaciones, pero que una inmensa nube de poder se escapa de nuestro control, se ha hecho ya con una fuerza tal que está casi lejos de nuestro alcance?
Are you speaking of the United States or Spain?
Del mundo.
Well, I mean, I was joking about Spain, but I don't think you can generalize about the entire world. I think the freedom that the government has to keep secrets and tell lies is greater in some societies than others. And there are some places where everything is a lie. I think of North Korea, for example. Whatever the North Koreans know about what their government is doing, they know by accident or by subterfuge or because it was smuggled in across the border from China. So I realize that's setting the bar very low, but most developed countries are in a better position than that, and some are better than others. None of us is perfect.
Hablemos de Wikileaks. Bill Keller fue el director del New York Times cuando el caso Wikileaks, y él al final de esta historia ha sido muy crítico con el tema, ha dicho que Wikileaks no ha aportado prácticamente nada, que incluso ha desencadenado unas acciones represivas mayores de las que existían antes. Pero yo lo que quería es que nos contara, primero, la historia de Wikileaks, vista desde su posición de director del periódico, y la historia de la relación del periódico con Julian Assange. ¿Qué era para el periódico Julian Assange? ¿Era una fuente informativa? ¿Era un socio? ¿Era un cómplice? ¿Nos puede contar el caso Wikileaks, Bill?
Julian who? Let me correct you. I didn't.
Assange.
No, I certainly did. I did not say that the whole WikiLeaks experience was insignificant. I think it was tremendously significant. I think it was a major news story. And I think it revealed a lot about how our government operates. And it is, I think of that trove of documents, which we still have and we still draw on week after week. It's sort of the gift that keeps on giving. In the initial reporting on WikiLeaks, nobody thought to write about the sons of Muammar Gaddafi. But when the unrest in Libya began, we went back to those documents and said, oh, look at how the sons of Muammar Gaddafi are living it up in London and so on. So there are things that weren't on the front of our attention then that I'm sure will still continue to become stories in the years ahead. So as a news event, as a source of information, it was tremendously important. My question was, there were some people who decided that WikiLeaks was a new era in government transparency, that from now on there would be no more secrets because somebody would leak them to an online whistleblower and governments would be perfectly transparent. In fact, there has been nothing even close to a leak as important as the initial document trove that we got. And in the US, at least, if anything, the government has become more restrictive and less transparent. I before was talking about our problems with the Bush administration. Under the Obama administration, there have been 6 criminal cases brought against government employees for leaking information to reporters. That's more than all of the previous presidents put together. Some of that, I think, is because Democrats, when they come into power, feel they have to prove that they're tough, because the Republicans are always accusing them of being weak. Some of it, though, is because of WikiLeaks. They are, in reaction to WikiLeaks, they are tightening the screws, or trying to tighten the screws, on particularly secrets that relate to national security.
La distancia del periodismo y la justicia, ¿cómo nos la podría explicar en los Estados Unidos? En España hay una acusación general permanente de que la justicia está muy politizada, que la política está muy judicializada y que el periodismo está muy contaminado por una relación con la justicia no sana, enferma. ¿Cuál es su diagnóstico de la situación de su país en relación con la democracia, el periodismo y la justicia?
I didn't get a translation of that one. I think we wore out the translator. She's been working her head off all day.
The relationship with... Could you hear?
I can hear you now, but I'm not sure I know the answer to the question. Does politics pollute journalism? Is that the right? Do I understand the question properly?
Sí.
Yeah. I mean, of course it does. I mean, politics gets into everything in any society. I mean, we have a different press culture in the US than in a lot of other countries. We try to be impartial and nonpartisan. That's an aspiration. We don't always succeed. And I would never argue that ours is the only culture that is correct. I mean, in most European countries, journalists belong to, it may be a right-of-center party, a right-of-center paper or a left-of-center paper. They acknowledge their political leanings at the outset, and readers know, readers understand that in those countries, so they know what to expect. Readers in America have been taught to expect that we will try very hard not to be driven by politics, not to be driven by ideology. And I think that works for us. It might not be the right approach for Spain or France or Germany, but I think it works for us. I didn't answer your question about Julian Assange, by the way. So while you reload your shotgun, you asked whether I thought of him as a journalist or a source or what. For us, on this project, he was a source. That is to say, he supplied us with information, and we gave him no participation in deciding what we would write about, how we would write it. He learned what the New York Times was going to write about the WikiLeaks documents, the same as every other reader when we published it. So in that sense, he was not, we talked a lot more to The Guardian, to El País, editor to editor, and they were more, I would say, collaborators. In that case, Julian was a source. But if, for example, the United States were to go after Julian Assange legally, as some have suggested, they have not decided to do that, but if they were to go after him under the espionage laws or some US laws, I would be the first to defend his right to do what he did. In putting those documents up, he was acting as a publisher, not the same kind of publisher as the New York Times or El País, but he was publishing documents. He had no obligation to the US government or anybody else to keep them secret, and so I would see that as a threat to press freedom generally if the United States were to go after him legally.
Hablemos ahora del mundo en Internet, las páginas web, las nuevas redes sociales, etc. Nosotros nos educamos en una tradición periodística que, en cierto sentido, ha estallado ahora de una forma muy clara. Y yo le quería preguntar, Bill, si cree que esta posibilidad que brinda la red abre nuevas vías a la verdad informativa o la hace más difícil. Yo recordaba ya una frase que me parece que es muy frecuente, se dice, durante las inundaciones lo primero que escasea es el agua potable. Y se dice, en los momentos en los que estamos inundados de información, más información que nunca ha habido, se dice, es cuando más escasea la buena información. Me gustaría que nos dijeras, Bill, cómo interpretas este estallido de las redes sociales desde esa perspectiva, como nuevas herramientas para el descubrimiento de las verdades más ocultas o como una manera de emboscarlas como consecuencia de la complejidad gigantesca que se ha producido y la superficialidad también a la que tanta cantidad de información nos ha condenado.
Well, I think both are true, actually. I think the internet has vastly expanded our ability to gather news. It's given us, for example, access to places that have been closed. Iran was one of the early examples. When the foreign reporters were all expelled from Iran in 2009 during the protests, people began using Twitter and YouTube to get out information about what was happening in the streets. It improves our ability to tell stories. I mean, at the New York Times, we have a very active social media department along with a digital graphics, and they're much more creative than they ever were when I was young at figuring out ways to present stories that are interesting and exciting. And of course, it vastly expands our distribution. We sell roughly 1 million copies of the New York Times on a typical day, a little less than that now because print circulation is going down. But every month we have between 40 and 50 million users who get access to us on the web. So for us, it's been a tremendous plus. But the negatives that you itemize are also there. I mean, there is a glut of information. You don't always know how reliable it is. There is a tendency, I think, in America, I don't know if this is true in Spain, but in America, our politics have become very polarized. The middle is almost evaporating. And some of that, I think, is because of the internet. You can put together your own news diet, and it can be made up of only of people who agree with you. And so on the right and on the left, you have people bombarded all day long with information that confirms what they already believe. Nobody ever challenges it, and that is potentially frightening. This is the way with change always. It's always almost always a mixed blessing.
As we can still to know that. Estoy teniendo problemas now, having problems with my phones. No sé si el público lo está teniendo también. ¿Están escuchando bien la traducción al castellano? Sí. Estoy teniendo problemas en mi phone aquí para escuchar la traducción. No quería saber si todo el mundo lo había podido entender o no lo había podido entender.
I'm just a print guy, so I don't know about all this technology, but
en su periódico, en el New York Times, ya han introducido han hecho un gran esfuerzo en el terreno de las nuevas tecnologías. De hecho, la nueva directora, la directora que la ha sustituido a usted, que te ha sustituido a ti, que en cierto sentido ha sido Bill Keller quien la ha colocado en esa posición, es una mujer que está especialmente adiestrada en los temas referidos a la página web, ¿no? Sí. Pero a mí no me importa nada saber si va a morir o no va a morir un soporte u otro soporte, eso no me preocupa nada. Lo que me preocupa mucho, Bill, es saber si va a morir una concepción del periodismo basada en la exigencia de calidad, la exigencia del máximo rigor, etc. ¿Cree Bill que eso está en peligro o no? O que aunque cambien los soportes, la voluntad de mantener ese tipo de gran valor del gran periodismo que representa Bill Keller sigue vivo todavía en las empresas y en los periodistas.
Well, you know, the last year that I was executive editor, the number one subject at the New York Times internally was the question of how to make money from the web, because print is declining. Eventually, print will probably go away. I don't know whether that's in 5 years or 20 years, but eventually print newspapers will become, they'll be like plastic records. You know, you can find them in a boutique, but they won't be commonplace. So we spent, this was mostly a decision for the publisher and the business side, but on this occasion he invited several people from the newsroom to be involved in this discussion, and what we came up with was a subscription model. And it was interesting because at the beginning of the year, there were a lot of people who said, you know, people will not pay for quality journalism online. There's so much free information out there, nobody will pay. But so far, anyway, we're proving that wrong. We began approximately a year ago now, a little less than a year ago, charging a subscription for complete access to our website. And it's been much more successful even than the optimists in the company predicted. Different people are going to find different ways of underwriting quality journalism, and you're seeing that in the States. There are some new investigative journalistic outfits, like one called ProPublica, that are supported by private philanthropists. There are other people who are talking about different subscription models. We're still at the very beginning of figuring out how we do this, but we do know that there is a market. There are people who demand good journalism, not just raw information. They want somebody to tell them, there's too much stuff in the air, tell me what I can trust and tell me what it means. And they will pay for that. Just as people decided maybe, you know, it used to be with the accepted wisdom that nobody would pay for music online. It could all be free. Remember Napster? It was all going to be free. Well, you can still get music free online. You can get anything you want free online, but people go to iTunes because it's not that expensive, it's so convenient, and you don't feel like a criminal.
Yo para expresar una opinión personal, es decir, que cuando aquí se habla tanto del riesgo que hay de que el periodismo pueda tener un porvenir negativo como consecuencia de todas estas cosas, yo siempre he creído que la verdadera amenaza para el periodismo es la pérdida de su vinculación con la sociedad. En España, en Bill, la sociedad está dando la espalda al periodismo porque cree que el periodismo le ha dado la espalda a la sociedad, porque el periodismo y la política han estado tan cerca que la sociedad ve a los periodistas y a los políticos como parte de un universo al que no le importan las cosas de los ciudadanos, que dicen que le importan las cosas de los ciudadanos, pero que solo le importan sus propias particulares cosas. Desde mi punto de vista, la verdadera amenaza para el periodismo es esa pérdida de contacto con la sociedad. Si no se pierde ese contacto con la sociedad, la tecnología, las herramientas, los instrumentos, los soportes, todo esto cambiarán, pero no pasará absolutamente nada. En España nosotros tenemos un gran peligro. Hay un descrédito enorme del periodismo por una asociación automática del periodismo con la política. Me gustaría saber si estás de acuerdo con este punto de vista y en vuestro país cómo está viviendo la sociedad esta imagen de los periodistas. ¿También está afectada la imagen de los periodistas, como aquí en España, aunque sea en menor medida?
Yeah, well, obviously I can't speak for Spain. My contacts with Spanish journalists have been with people that seem to me to be very serious, high-quality journalists. I have friends who work at El País, for example, and I think they're, you know, the work they do is of the highest quality. But I do think the most dangerous thing is when people become cynical, when people believe that everybody's dishonest or everybody's corrupt or everybody lies and nobody is to be trusted. I think that makes democracy very, very difficult. And I have seen, when I talked before about the polarization in our country, some of that is from a kind of cynicism. My favorite culprit in this is the Fox News channel, which I've criticized on a number of occasions. They're not the only culprit, but in a way they kind of invented this make-believe news where they pretended to give you a fair and balanced report, but it was actually a right-wing report. Yeah. And there have been copycats on both the right and the left. So you get this kind of phony journalism that is, I think, very dangerous in a democracy because people begin to think they're all liars. They're all like that. You can't trust anything. We'll just believe what our friends tell us on the internet. And you end up with citizens who are not educated, who turn their back, turn away from whatever their government is doing because they feel they have no control over it and they don't understand it. So I think it's wherever it happens, in our country, yours, or any other, it's a dangerous tendency.
Y lo que llamamos aquí el infotainment, la televisión sobre todo, ha puesto casi, ya ha convertido casi en una regla, una información que no es exactamente una información, es un juego que no es exactamente un juego, este infotainment, noticias muy light, muy ligerito, muy breve, muy rápido, de muy fácil digestión, de muy fácil olvido, absolutamente superficial, sin ninguna pretensión de nada que pueda resultar de una cierta utilidad, ha llegado a convertirse casi en un dogma que fuera de ese tipo, de ese modelo, no existe la supervivencia posible, ¿no? ¿El infotainment es una amenaza para el periodismo? No.
It's certainly a threat for broadcast journalism, and I think, we've had that phenomenon too for a long time. It begins with cutting the budgets for the news departments. Very serious television news departments decide, well, we don't really need a correspondent in Africa or a correspondent in Jerusalem, or that's so expensive, and people don't really care about foreign news anyway, so let's save some money there. And we don't really need quite so many people covering investigative reporting. That's very hard. It takes a long time to finish an investigative story. Let's just rewrite the press releases from the government. And that tendency has been going on for a long time. It's not a new thing. In a sense, maybe this is just too optimistic, but I think it's possible that the internet and cable television, alternatives to the sort of big broadcasting outfits, may provide an alternative forum for serious investigative journalism, for foreign reporting, and for things that the major outlets have cut back on. And in the long run, they may, I hope, realize that was not a smart business decision on their part. But, I may be a little overly optimistic on that front. It's my nature.
¿Cuál ha de ser la distancia exacta entre el periodista y el político? Yo tengo amigos que son periodistas y que militan en un partido político, yo no sabría, pero hay quien lo es y es buen periodista. Hay otros que viven muy dentro de la propia vida de la política, así tienen mucha información. Otros dicen que si viven así, viven como empotrados, como embedded, como los soldados en el ejército cuando van a las guerras. ¿Cuál es la distancia exacta? Hay una parábola de Schopenhauer que se llama El puerco espín, que yo la recuerdo un momento, que dice: es muy difícil acertar con la distancia exacta. Dos puercos espín en una noche de invierno, de mucha nieve, tenían frío y se acercaban buscando calor. Si no se acercaban lo suficiente, no sentían calor. Y si se acercaban demasiado, serían con los pinchos. A mí siempre me ha parecido una buena metáfora para ver qué difícil resulta la relación con los políticos. Demasiado lejos, uno no se entera de nada. Demasiado cerca, uno se entera todavía de menos. ¿Cuál es la distancia a la que hay que estar con la política y con los gobiernos, Bill? Usted, que desde un cargo tan importante como este, tú estoy hablando del tuyo, usted, desde un cargo tan importante como este, ha tenido que estar desde en la Casa Oval hasta en tantos lugares. ¿Cuál es la distancia que puede considerarse la distancia profesional?
It's an excellent question, and it's something that I think journalists everywhere, including in the United States, wrestle with all of the time, because politicians control a very, very important commodity. They control access. And it's, it's so seductive to be taken along on the foreign trip, to be invited in for the lunch, to get the phone call from the official who's only going to tell you this great, important news story. And it is very much like a romantic seduction. I think the correct relationship between journalists and politicians is adversarial, not hostile, not cynical, but adversarial. We may share some common interests, but we are not in the same business. At a place like the New York Times, much of that responsibility falls to editors to serve as a kind of watchdog to make sure that reporters are not being seduced. I think nowadays with the sort of the fact that everybody is a press critic online gives an extra layer of kind of safety. If you are seen to be an apologist for a politician, or sort of if you're too close to that porcupine, you will be challenged on it, and I think that's healthy. I mean, I guess the solution to most of these problems is a diversity of journalism.
¿Cuál ha sido tu experiencia personal de relación con los personajes políticos de los Estados Unidos? ¿Con quién has tenido una buena relación? ¿Con quién has tenido una mala relación? ¿Cuál ha sido, desde tu punto de vista, la mejor relación y la peor relación con los grandes personajes de la política en estos años? En tu caso.
I'm not sure that I've had a very good relationship with any of them that lasted for very long. Your relationship with a politician lasts only as long as they like what you're writing, and that's often not very long. I mean, I had, as editor, I had a rough time during the Bush administration. People like Vice President Cheney in particular tended to make it personal. But that's not the hardest thing about being an editor or a journalist. The being attacked by public figures, and to some extent, it's a badge of honor if you are criticized by. There are a lot of public officials I respect. I think that and I think as a general rule, we tend to look down on politicians or be suspicious of politicians, that they have a hidden agenda, that they have the hand in the till. I think it's important to say that an awful lot of people who go into politics or go into other kinds of government work are not in it for the glory or the money or the influence. There are a lot of people in government, elected and unelected, who really see themselves as doing good for the general public, and I don't think we should ever become so cynical that we turn away, that we don't give credit to those people. That's probably enough.
Sí, bueno, y luego decía el dinero. La información es muy cara y la opinión es muy barata. la opinión la expresa cualquiera, sin necesidad de coger un avión, sin necesidad de estar mucho tiempo. Por eso, entre otras cosas, hay más opinión, menos información.
Absolutely.
Y las empresas pues están apretando un poco en esta dirección. Morirá, digamos, está amenazado por del periodismo precisamente porque hay una gran desproporción entre la opinión y la información.
I didn't get the question again. Sorry.
No. Yeah, too much opinion.
She's repeating.
She's repeating.
Oh, I hope not. I hope not. I mean, it is, when I was the executive editor, I had a budget for the newsroom of $200 million a year. That's to pay all the payroll, to pay, as you say, those expensive trips for correspondents to go to exotic places, the cost of maintaining a secure bureau in Kabul or Baghdad is tremendous. And that isn't even all of it. I mean, there's some other things that were not on my budget that are really important to doing journalism. For example, the lawyers who protect you if you get into some legal trouble, somebody sues you, it's good to have a legal department behind you. Or if the government subpoena comes with a subpoena and says you have to reveal your source, it's very nice to have a good lawyer that somebody else is paying who will protect you from that government subpoena. So you're absolutely right that gathering news then doing it well and doing it in depth is very expensive. Having an opinion is basically free. You can sit in your home, in your bathrobe, and with your cup of coffee, and you can have an opinion on any subject at all. But maybe I'm too much of an optimist, but I think there is a demand for news, not just opinion, for information that people can trust. And where there's a demand, there's a market.
Sí, además esa información que cuesta tanto dinero y tiempo conseguir, luego pues está en el mercado y cualquiera la coge y la roba. Bill Keller ha sido bastante severo con un aspecto de esta iniciativa de Huffington Post, precisamente por hacer un uso excesivo. Porque sí que parece que ocurre esto, es decir, la posibilidad de que cada medio conecta a través de links distintas informaciones que ha tomado de unos y de otros, pero que en ocasiones, más que conectar, las coge sencillamente en tal cantidad que casi hace inútil ir a la fuente original. Digamos, trabajar para otros, ¿no? Digamos, las grandes oportunidades que brinda la red, brinda también nuevas complicaciones. Y en ocasiones, a quien haga un esfuerzo de información caro, complejo, etcétera, le debe producir un poquito de dolor de cabeza que luego esté sencillamente utilizado por un gran número de otras instituciones o organizaciones que también en cierto sentido son competidoras. Esto le ha pasado le ha pasado al New York Times, te ha pasado a ti, ¿no? Esto te ha ocurrido.
Yes, it's the phenomenon we refer to as aggregation. I don't know if there's a good Spanish or Basque word for it, but it's the phenomenon that you described. I'll start by saying, just maybe to surprise you, just saying something nice about Huffington Post. I mean, it is true that Huffington Post started out as mainly an aggregator. They took other people's news stories and summarized them, and then put some political spin on them and gave you some funny stories together, and that's how Huffington Post was built. But gradually, the Huffington Post has come to see the value in original journalism. They have hired actual reporters who go places, and one of them just won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on the trauma of American veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan and the health problems they have and their neglect. It was a serious piece of work. And I hope that this is a tendency. I mean, in some respect, we're all aggregators. We refer to other people's work when we're building a story. When I was a foreign correspondent, I often would get an idea for a story from the local paper in a city in Russia or a local paper in Johannesburg. And you build on that with your own reporting. So aggregation in and of itself is not an evil thing. My two caveats about aggregation are, first of all, it's not a substitute for actually going out and witnessing things yourself. And second of all, there's a big difference between publishing a link to somebody else's work and running such a long excerpt or summary of that work that nobody needs to go to the link anymore. So, and that latter practice, right, where you're just paraphrasing somebody else's story, it does seem to me to be stealing.
Bueno, hacer pronósticos es una cosa muy difícil y, por otra parte, yo creo que los periodistas tampoco tenemos por qué dedicarnos a hacer pronósticos. En todo caso, no es fácil hacerlo porque el mundo está en una gran transformación. Hemos aludido un poco a la gran transformación que significa la web, las redes sociales, etc. Pero hay otras transformaciones también que están ahora mismo produciéndose y que yo no sé qué efecto va a poder tener sobre nuestra concepción del periodismo y de la democracia. Es, por ejemplo, el peso creciente que va adquiriendo, por ejemplo, la cultura china, el poder de China, que es una sociedad bastante singular, que está en el mercado de la economía abierta, pero al mismo tiempo está en un reglamento político completamente diferente, que ejerce un peso mayor cada día y que muchas veces yo me he preguntado qué efecto va a poder tener sobre nuestra tradición de periodismo libre, abierto, etc. Estamos condenados a vivir un choque contra eso. Estaremos en cierto sentido contagiados en algún momento porque el peso creciente de la economía china venga acompañado también de un peso creciente de otras maneras de entender la información, el control de las cosas, ¿o no? ¿Nos contagiarán o les contagiaremos? Dicho de otra manera, en el manejo de la información y de la libertad de información.
I think we will infect them, because I think the strength of information is too great. You know, I think that the future of quality journalism, not just all journalism, but the kind of journalism that makes you think. The future comes in two parts. I think there will be survivors. I hope the New York Times will be one. I hope there will be a number of them in Spain as well. But these are established news organizations that know how to adapt, that are prepared to take advantage of the new technologies, not pretend they don't exist and not resist them, but harness them and use them. So survivors will be one category, and then what they call in tech land startups. There'll be sort of new, small, entrepreneurial forms of journalism. We're already seeing quite a few of them in the States. Some of them are already failing, and some of them are beginning to show success. Because we're still in the laboratory phase of the new world of journalism. I think the biggest change in the New York Times newsroom over the past 5 or 10 years has been that it has become like a startup laboratory. The Times used to be very famous for being kind of conservative, not in the political sense, but in the, we are set in our ways. This is the way the New York Times does things. Oh, we don't do that because we're the New York Times. That was sort of the famous attitude. And now there is an atmosphere of experimentation, a lot of it coming from young people we've brought in with graphic skills and other internet skills, social media skills, and the attitude is much more, that's interesting, let's try it. And I think that attitude I hope that attitude will keep the New York Times alive, at least long enough to pay my pension.
Sí. Bueno, me Mientras tanto, en España hay muchísimos jóvenes que aspiran a ser periodistas, pero que ahora mismo no tienen posibilidad alguna de trabajar, en un momento de crisis muy, muy serio, que ha provocado despidos en gran número y que ha cerrado las puertas a una gran cantidad de personas que aspiran al periodismo. Pero sobre todo, lo que antes decía, que lo que es peor es que al observar que apenas hay sitio y que el único sitio que parece que está ahora mismo, en el que parece que se respira económicamente, es en esto que llamamos en infotainment, una cierta invitación a la frivolidad, que hace que posiblemente pues, no estén muy... Dijo una vez Bill Keller algo que me gustó mucho a mí, que decían, bueno, este periodismo grande, como la gran dama gris, se llama en el New York Times, ¿no? Dice, es como un viejo dinosaurio. Y me parece que dijo un día Bill Keller, ya, pero los dinosaurios vivieron millones de años, tampoco se vean ustedes a creer, ¿no? En fin. Y una cosa sobre todo que me interesaría mucho, la actitud de un hombre desde el punto de vista intelectual, la visión intelectual de su trabajo. No sé dónde leí una vez, Bill, en una entrevista que hicieron, que dijeron, lo que más alegría me da a mí en el mundo es que mi trabajo le diga a alguien, anda, no lo sabía. Hacer de mi trabajo que la gente diga, no lo sabía. O, pues no se me había ocurrido nunca observar las cosas desde el ángulo que tú me las acabas ahora de presentar. Y sobre todo, puesto que uno reúne una reunión que pretende hablar de secretos y mentiras, cuando decías, me importa menos lo que hay detrás de una puerta cerrada, pero me importa mucho que la gente use su cerebro, que mi trabajo sirva para hacer que la gente use su cerebro. No sé si se recogió bien, pero lo recogió de unas declaraciones que hiciste alguna vez y me pareció muy interesante y me gustaría que comentaras esa declaración. Lo que mueve a un periodista.
Well, people come into journalism for different reasons. I mean, and I have friends who fall into all of these categories. There are some people who come in because they want to change the world. You know, they want to uncover wrongdoing, corruption, evil, and expose it and change it. There are people who come into it because they just love to tell stories. They like to gather an audience around and tell them stories. There are people who go into journalism because they think it's a great adventure. They can travel to exotic places and meet interesting people and all of that. There are people who do it for not terribly noble reasons. They just like attention. You know, they like to see their name in the newspaper. And to some extent, I feel a little bit of each of those things, I suppose. But to me, personally, the main appeal of journalism is what I think of as the puzzle. It's taking a complicated situation, it might be a political situation in a country, it might be an economic problem, or a character that you're trying to figure out, and reporting as hard as you can, gathering as much information as you can until you get to a point where you think you understand it better, and then explaining it. And I've said on several occasions, my favorite reaction, the reaction that I most enjoy hearing from a reader is not, oh, I didn't know that. My favorite reaction is, oh, I never thought of it that way before. But that's personal. You know, all those other reasons are perfectly valid reasons for going into journalism. And here's what I tell young people who are thinking of going into journalism. As I've already said, I do believe there will be journalism, good journalism. There will be opportunities. And you know, let's face it, a lot of the people who are now established journalists started out working for very little money. They started out as freelancers, which is the most thankless job in journalism. They started out working for small-town newspapers. And you know, nowadays they may start out working for a blog or a website, or again freelancing from some part of the world where news organizations no longer have correspondence. But suppose I'm wrong. Suppose that there is no future for news organizations. Learning how to be a journalist is essentially developing a set of skills. You learn how to acquire information, sometimes secret information, sometimes information that's very difficult to get. And then you test the information. You try to find out if it's accurate, if there's some other part of it that's missing. Then you look for patterns in the information. What do these things add up to? And then you figure out a way to explain this in kind of clear language so people can understand it. If you have that set of skills, you can use it at a lot of places aside from journalism. Academia, government, science, the law, all need people who know how to handle information in a serious professional way. So if all of journalism, if the asteroids hit the Earth and the dinosaurs all die, there still will be other things that you can do with those skills.
Yo creo que... Bueno, es tradición, me han dicho, que el público pueda participar haciendo alguna pregunta. Supongo que Bill no tiene inconveniente, ¿no?, en responder a la pregunta del público. Entonces quisiéramos que los últimos minutos de este encuentro pudieran ser cubiertos por las preguntas del público. Sin problemas, ¿no? Bill? Sí.
Just don't give the microphone to my wife.
Sí, sí.
She's sitting right down there in the front row.
No. You know.
Buenas tardes. Yo soy la hermana de Nieves de Larracoechea, que era una de las 270 víctimas del Pan Am 103, del atentado terrorista en Lockerbie, Escocia, en el 21 de diciembre de 1988. Y hasta hoy, a la fecha, no creo en lo que tenemos. 23 años y 4 meses después, ni yo ni muchas familias que seguimos luchando por la verdad. Usted ha estado en puntos estratégicos a lo largo de todos estos años en cuanto a nuestro caso. Yo les he informado desde aquí, desde Nueva York, al New York Times en concreto, durante todo este tiempo. Y habiendo expresado mi posición, lo que me interesaba era oír la suya, puesto que ha tenido acceso a tanta información. Yo personalmente no he visto lo suficiente para creer que ha sido Libia, a pesar de que nos lo han vendido así, como una conveniencia política y financiera por silencio, mi opinión personal. Entonces le agradecería que nos dé la suya sobre este caso. Y tengo que decir, por desgracia, que el descrédito de los medios informativos de este país en cuanto al caso son absolutamente merecidos. Gracias.
Wow. Well, obviously, I'm sorry for your family's loss. I'm not an expert in the Lockerbie disaster, but I do know that an awful lot of journalistic energy has been spent trying to trace the ultimate cause of that. I mean, as far as I know, certainly the last things that I read on that, the trails seem to end in Libya. And some officials in the Libyan government even acknowledged as much and paid some insignificant reparations, I believe. I mean, it's possible that now that there's a change of regime in Libya and journalists may get access to documents that have not been accessible before, that we will learn more about that, how that tragedy happened. I don't know, but that's really about as much as I can say on that subject, because it's as much as I know.
Sí, hola, buenas tardes. Ha mencionado usted que durante la administración Obama ha habido 6 casos de oficiales, personas de la administración que han sido acusadas por verter secretos a los medios de comunicación. Me gustaría preguntarle por uno de esos casos. Es el caso de John Kiriakou y su opinión al respecto. Muy brevemente, para que el público lo sepa, es un antiguo agente de la CIA que cuando abandona la agencia acusa públicamente a la administración Bush en su segundo mandato de perpetrar técnicas interrogatorias utilización absoluta de tortura, ¿no? El senador entonces Obama lo dice públicamente que él, en cuanto llegue a la presidencia, va a prohibir la tortura y es así, ¿no? En cambio, pues hace unas pocas semanas la Administración de Justicia de la Administración Obama precisamente ha acusado a John Kiriakou de, bueno, en realidad de filtrar los nombres de los que presuntamente fueron los torturadores. Y eso también ha llevado a que su mujer, que todavía seguía trabajando en la agencia, fuera obligada a dimitir, ¿no? Y básicamente esa era la pregunta y sí, por supuesto, eso podría tener un coste en la carrera electoral del presidente Obama. Gracias.
I don't think it will probably have any bearing on Obama's chances of re-election. I can say a little bit about that case. I want to be kind of careful because, of course, one of the news organizations that he's accused of leaking to is the New York Times. And I don't want to say something that will make his predicament worse than it is. Two things that I think I can say are, first of all, the information that we were looking for about waterboarding and other forms of torture, our aim was not to expose the people who carried out the torture because they were low-ranking people who were, you know, the problem was not the individuals who did the torture, the problem was the policy that allowed the torture. And the reason that we were interested in that was not so that we could say, here's the guy who did it. We wanted to find out what it was like, how many times they did it, whether there were some public claims that waterboarding was a very effective form of interrogation. We were suspicious of that. We wanted to find out how many times they waterboarded people before they began to answer questions and things like that. So, you know, our aim was not to demonize the low-ranking person. It was to write about the policy and whether it was effective. The other thing, and here's where I have to be kind of careful, but because I don't know the government hasn't shown me their evidence in this case, so I don't know what they know. But my hunch is that this is the kind of case, the kind of leak that in previous administrations would have been handled with a reprimand. They would not, even under the Bush administration, I think, or under the Clinton administration, they would not have threatened somebody with many years in prison for that kind of behavior. And so when I say that this administration has not been as transparent or as friendly to freedom of information as some of its predecessors, that's the kind of example I had in mind.
Sí, perdón. ¿Puedes acercar el micrófono allí? Sí, tenemos que concluir, me dicen, dentro de un momento, pero alguna pregunta más, porque se ha levantado la mano por ahí. ¿Se pueden acercar el micrófono a esta persona que está ahí pidiendo la palabra? Bueno, no sé. Me temo que hay un problema con el micrófono. No, ahí viene ya.
Maybe somebody has a question for you.
No. Move. Everybody knows my point of view. Yes. Everybody knows my point. Yeah.
Hola. Quería preguntarle a Bill Keller si, bueno, en España últimamente hay mucha tradición de que los políticos no permitan preguntas en sus ruedas de prensa, por lo que realmente creo que no son ruedas de prensa. Querría saber si en Estados Unidos eso también ha ocurrido ahí y cómo los periodistas han hecho frente, si es que han hecho frente. Gracias.
Unfortunately, that's also true in the United States. And the only solution that journalists have come up with is to yell the questions as loud as they can anyway, so that the question sort of hangs in the air and the journalist hopes that maybe the official who gave the press conference is a little bit embarrassed by walking away. But some politicians don't understand embarrassment.
Bueno, pues ya lo dejamos entonces aquí para que continúe el programa previsto por la organización esta. Muchas gracias, señores. Gracias.
Thank you.